Thanks for coming out on this wonderful, warm, sunny spring day. Really appreciate it. My name is Sarah Colley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Great Falls Public Library. We are here to serve as a connection point to empower the community and enhance the quality of life by providing individuals access to information and social, cultural, and recreational resources. So this is part of our storytelling series this winter. The National Storytelling Network defines storytelling as an interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. We have gone through plenty of different varieties of storytelling through our winter speaker series. We've had Leilani and her use of storytelling in documentaries. We have spoken with Alyssa and her use of music and art in order to tell stories. And now we get to speak with Chris Latreille. Chris Latreille is the Montana Poet Laureate. A lot of us know Chris. Some are related to Chris. And this is just going to be an amazing opportunity. So Chris Latreille is a Métis storyteller and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. He is the author of one-sentence journal, short poems, and essays from the world at large. His next book is coming out in August, and that will be Becoming Little Shell. And that book, we will have a little party here as well, so stay tuned for more information. But I'm going to let Chris do all of the talking today, because all of this is about his books and use of poetry in storytelling. This program is sponsored in part by Humanities Montana, and they are a huge reason as to why Chris was able to make it out today. So without further ado, please welcome Chris Latreille.
Well, bonjour. Dinaway Maganadug. Chris Ka Shinikishin. That is hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabe-Moan. That's the bonjour in Dinaway Maganadug part. And then Chris Ka Shinikishin is, you may call me Chris, in Michif, which is also the language of the Little Shell people. Ojibwe, Michif. I'm already going off my plan based on what Sarah talked about, the whole idea of story. I don't make plans because I don't stick to them. So I'm going to read a few things and I'll talk and hopefully answer questions. I call myself a Métis storyteller because, and poetry is just one of the ways that I tell stories. And to me, it's all storytelling. I mean, everything we do, every discussion we have, every way that we move through the world and interact with each other is we're telling stories. And poetry is one way. Books like this is the advanced reader copy of my book that's coming out this summer, is storytelling. To me, no different than the poems I write. That's how we preserve who we are. So every way that we do things to try and preserve culture or language or art or the stories of our lives or our families or anything physical goes away. No matter what, it's going to go away. And I like to ask like students that question. If you wanted to save something for 10,000 years, for 20,000 years, how would you do it? And I'm always trying to set a trap for them to say, put it on the cloud. So that I can say the cloud is going away at some point. As powerful as we think these technology corporations are, like Google and all of the people that serve that part of our culture now, and it's an important and a big one, nothing lasts forever. Sooner or later, one of these corporate entities is going to do something so egregious that they will have to be set on fire and buried in the ocean. And then someone's going to forget paying the server bill, and all of a sudden everything you've got in the cloud is gone. And we were talking earlier about journalism, and the Missoula Independent, when it was bought out by a corporation and then shuttered, the first thing they did, because the indie folks unionized, they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that you've written and we're going to lock it up so nobody can have it. So years and years and years of people writing, building their careers, writing for this independent weekly, all of a sudden poof, gone. You can't access it anymore. So how do we preserve? We preserve it through stories. Like if I want people to know about me, I'm going to tell all of you. And hopefully if I make enough of an impression, you tell a few people, and a few people tell a few people, and those people tell a few people. And that's how the age-old idea of word of mouth continues. And think about that. Think of the stories on the walls in caves in France or whatever that are 15,000 years old, or however those things are, of the animals. And we learn from their lives because of the stories that they preserved that way and the stories that they told about them moving forward. And the guy who paints all these animals decides, you know what, here's a blank wall, I'm just going to put my hand in there and I'm going to put it on the wall. And I'm going to tell the world that I'm here. Do you think that person had any idea that people would be seeing that 15,000 years later or whatever it is? And I tell kids when I go in as Poet Laureate, I get to go and visit schools and talk to kids, 4th graders, 3rd graders, high schoolers, college kids. And first I ask them, who's a poet? And there might be one kid kind of shyly, like hiding them with his body, his hands, and nobody else in the room sees it. And then I ask them, well, how many of you text? And of course they all raise their hands. And then I proceed to tell them, you're all poets. Because to my mind, texting is just the modern version of poetry. And I would say that right now there are more active poets in the world than there has ever been in the history of humanity because everybody texts. And I'd say, tell me I'm wrong. Why do you text? What are the things that you're sharing through texting? You're sharing your happiness when something good happens. You're sharing your sorrows when something bad happens. Sometimes you're just telling the people in your life that you love them. Or telling the world that you love the world through a text. And you can just kind of see the synapses like misfiring and sparking and smoking, but then they start to get it. Poetry is something that has had a bag thrown over its head and dragged off to academia and took it away from the rest of us. And the rest of us are reclaiming it by writing whatever the hell we want via text. And some of those people are going to decide that they want to take it to the next level. They're going to say, you know what, I'm not just going to share it with my family and my text group. I'm going to start writing some of this down, and I'm going to do other things with it. And that then proceeds to generate that next round of art, of expression. And it doesn't have to be texting. It doesn't have to be words on a page. I tell my students, the least important thing to me is what ends up on the page when we do our poetry workshops. That's the last thing I care about, is what you actually write. To me, poetry is a practice of going out in the world and paying attention to it. Paying attention to the world, listening to what the world has to tell you, and letting that get into your head and stir things up in your heart and your spirit, and then maybe something emerges on the page. But what's most important is that it emerges into your life. Because poetry is life. It's a way to view the world. It's a way to be in the world. And from the indigenous perspective, I think poetry is hand in hand with our Anishinaabe worldview. In the Anishinaabe worldview, we believe in what's called the 7 grandfather teachings. And the idea being that if you live according to these 7 teachings, then every footstep becomes a prayer. And I love that idea of moving through your life with so much love and respect and humility and courage and all of those things, that somehow you're making the world better through the prayer of just your existence in moving through the world and the people you affect. Poetry does the same thing. If you're paying attention, if you're living a life of poetry, if you're listening to the people around you, if you are paying attention to the world outside and the world inside and what's going on inside you, then every footstep becomes a poem. And I feel like the 2 versions of the same thing. And that listening that we use to generate our poetry is also an indigenous worldview. Because in our creation story, in our idea of how the world was created, the world exists. Kichi Manitou, the great mystery, our creator, has already created everything, and the world is perfect, except they recognize that there's one thing missing. And that one thing is the human person. All the other people that we share the world with are already there. And to make it perfect, we're going to add this one final occupant of this beautiful world. So Kichi Manitou takes a handful of soil from each of the 4 directions of Mother Earth and places it in a shell. And then breathes through that shell. And what emerges from the other side, the mixture of that breath and all of the things that make soil so rich and smelly and tasty and beautiful, and the holy breath, and what emerges on the other side is the first person, Nana Buju, Wayna Buju, Nana Bush. There's many names for them. But Nana Buju is the first person. And his first task is to go out in the world and listen to everything that is being said by everybody else who's already here, and to learn from them. And as the last denizens of our world, we're still in that trying to catch up phase with everybody else. We're still in a position where we really need to double down on listening to what the world is telling us. Somewhere along the line, we got overwhelmed with our own creativity and our own genius and stopped listening. Because when Nana Buju was out there, he could speak the language that everybody else spoke. There was a common language that everybody spoke to communicate, and he learned who the plants are, who the animals are, what they can give to us, how they make our lives better. And at some point, we turned away from that, and we lost the ability to listen. And look at where we are, poised on the brink of destruction, depending on how you want to view it. But there's no denying that we are in a state, unlike any position we've ever been, as long as people have been on the world. I think poetry and the arts are the solution to that. Because what they do is they put us out in the world and start that paying attention process. Because that language is still being spoken. We're just not the ones who are listening. But more and more of us are. And I feel like that was my journey into poetry without even realizing. When I was like in the depths of my own personal despair, that we all face, loss of family, loss of my position in the world, all those things. I went out into the world and just started paying attention to what the rivers had to say to me, to what the wind in the trees and all of those flowery, hallmark-sounding ideas about being out in nature. Well, it's there for a reason, and those languages, those words are being spoken, and we can hear it. It's not like walking up to a tree and saying, hey, how's it going? And the tree's like, well, the wind's a little rough. It's kind of hard to hold the leaves today. But it's not like that. Some of us already do it. I mean, we have pets. I have a Chihuahua. If I don't pay attention to what he's telling me, he's like, dude, it's your fault, and I've got a mess to clean up. Think about those of you who have houseplants. And you can tell when they need water or they need to be moved into light. You have a relationship with that plant that is at a level that maybe isn't the same as the relationship you have with your kid. I told you to water that plant. It's different, but the communication is there. And that communication spreads throughout everything that we share the world with. And that is how I feel poetry and the act of paying attention and why that is poetry is the key to what it's all about. And with all of that I didn't even intend to start with, I will read a few, since we are clearly on the cusp of spring. I'm going to read a few short excerpts from my first book, One Sentence Journal, which was the result of all of that, going out in the world and paying attention. And the thing about that book is, everything I'd written, had just written, with no intention that it was ever going to be a book. And then it became one. And I thought, there'd be 50 copies, and 40 would be stashed in my mom's closet somewhere. And it would just be another thing that goes away. And it didn't. I mean, people connected to it, and I wouldn't be here without it. And the curious thing about it is that book came out on August 14th, 2018, and it was August 14th, 2023 that I got a call from the governor saying I'd been appointed Montana Poet Laureate. So 5 years to the day. And that's, to me, one of those coincidences that tells me there are no coincidences. There is a plan. And we live in the world, and that plan acts upon us, if we allow it to. So these are excerpts from, and what it is, it's a collection of poems that began literally as just sentences written down in a notebook. This practice I began when I had a job that I hated and was killing me, at some point I decided, I'm just going to write one sentence every day. That way, no matter what happens, no matter what bullshit I have to exist in that day, for that 5 minutes, I'm a writer in my notebook, like writers have been doing for millennia, and I can feel like I did something that I care about. And then later, I turned my favorite sentences into short little poems, and that is basically the foundation of what one sentence journal is. And this is just a few examples of some of those related to spring. And this very first one I am going to dedicate to today. Snow makes her return like a visitor who, after leaving, returns with a knock at the door because she's forgotten her keys just as you've taken your pants off. Like I was already breaking out my summer capsule collection, my shorts and stuff, and here we are. Lunchtime, a cacophony of activity at the yard and bird feeders, the rooster in full voice a block or two away, and against a puffy gunmetal sky, 3 V's of geese honking by overhead. I was out at Freeze Out Lake yesterday morning, and it wasn't so much the geese, but the swans. So many swans out there. Sunshine gets all the fanfare, but I live for foggy mornings on the river, mist rising in clouds from its surface, herons overhead heard unseen. I love birds. A friend of mine, on social media you get these, like, people will take a picture of nature and they'll put pretty words over it. And she sent it to me, and I was very grateful, but I couldn't remember that I'd actually written that. So I had to go through the book, and that was the one she used. And yes, I did write it. I was kind of happy about that. A muddy flatbed pickup leaves a prickly trail of green hay across the churned up white crusty field and drags the bovine centipede forward, huffing. So these are little short stories to myself. And people might read them and wonder, well, what does that even mean? And that's the thing about poems, and that's what I tell kids, is you don't know when your experience can generate a similar experience in somebody else or something totally unrelated. Because as soon as it goes out in the world, it's everybody's. It's not just mine anymore. So that might read as something totally different to someone, but to me, I can see that drive into Frenchtown and the field and the guy driving his tractor leaving hay for the horses or for the cattle, and they're just following along behind him like a caterpillar, like a centipede. Mist rises from the fields as I drive home in the waning light before nighttime, and an owl appears out of the gloom to land atop a power pole. The old cat grumbles and wheezes her way through a couple minutes at the kibble bowl in the hallway behind me, then shuffles back to her cushion, dragging my heart in her wake. I often do events unrelated to poetry or being Poet Laureate, because I do a lot of different things, and a relative over here was asking how I make my living as a writer. It's from cobbling together any opportunity to do anything writing related, and most of the money comes from writing adjacent things, like speaking or whatever. And now and then I get checks to actually write stuff, but it's the writing adjacent stuff. And so I go out and I'm doing this event with another writer, and we're talking about nothing related to my role as Poet Laureate. Towards the end, during the Q&A session, someone raises their hand and she says, "Read us a poem, because you're the Poet Laureate." I'm like, I think, I should be prepared for that, but I'm not. And I'm not, I can't, earlier, I was trying to remember the title of my own book, and I couldn't remember what it was. I don't remember stuff. There's so many Iron Maiden and Ramones and Kiss lyrics crammed into his head, I can't remember anything else. So it's like, you don't pull a string on my back and poems emerge, like, "Put a snake in your boot," like Woody from Toy Story. But one popped into my head, and I'm reminded of it because of my old cat, who now is ashes in a box on my little altar where I sit and burn my medicines every morning, because she was always there with me. And so there's that short story to her, hearing her behind me at her food bowl. And then this other one that came to my head in this room full of people, not so different from you, feet skilled at finding cat puke in the dark. Which the fourth graders love. But the you know, it's in Seeley Lake, and people are like, and you're the Poet Laureate? But it's a short story to myself, number one. And number two, it summons that particular cat who was such a champion hurler. And the relationship I had with her that, you know, if I got up in the middle of the night, I'd carry my phone, so I'm walking to make sure. And she was gorilla skilled at it too, because I'd look in my office, all clear, I'd sit down at my desk and stick my feet out. There it is, under my desk. And all of those stories, and yeah, it's funny and it's gross, but who doesn't, who has cats, have a relationship with their vomitus proclivities? It's something we can relate to, and it doesn't have to be this huge world ending. Sometimes it's just about that cat you used to have and you miss her, you know, and all of the things about her that were frustrating at the time, but you know, you think, God, if I could just step in her puke one more time, right? Okay. Tell me something I need to know that I don't, said the smug, wealthy man from California, and I answered, everything. Here's a poem that was in a Swan Valley Connections quarterly newsletter, I guess, whatever you call it. This is a spring poem too, Super Bloom. Leave it to the flowers to show us how the world celebrates the arrival of spring. Like the desert whose surges in technicolor at the return of the sun, alluvial hues flooding the thirsty plain of a fever's dream. Do you greet the arriving season, each and every season, as you would this long-lost friend? Or even as the lover you return to again and again, knowing that for all the blush, they are destined to become the one you most look forward to moving on from. You part, the wheel turns, the moons rise and fall, and then here they are again, renewed at your doorstep, aglow with fresh light, and oh, how you've missed each other. We get tired of every season by the time it's over for the most part, you know, and they show, like spring gets here, like spring, and a few weeks of rain and whatever, and it's like, I just want summer, you know, then summer and everything's on fire, it's like, God, I just want fall, you know, and it just goes over and over again, we forget. That's why there's so many people in the world, because people forget what it's like to have kids. So what is a poet laureate? I did a talk in Whitefish, and their principal pronounced laureate in a way that I have no idea how he arrived at that. He did it twice, so I know he thought it was correct. But what is it? You know, so what it means is I'm like the official poet of Montana. I'm the official representative of poetry for the state of Montana. It has nothing to do with me being the best poet or any of that stuff. I think there's a lot of reasons I was chosen because I'm willing to go places that other people don't. And they're like, oh, let's get Latreille, he'll do it. I call myself the in case of emergency break glass guy. Because I get asked at the last minute to do a lot of stuff. And to me, that is why I am happy to do it, because every time I get up and talk, I get to tell people about the little shell. I get to tell people about the Métis. I get to be an example to young people to say, look, you don't have to do all the things that everybody's telling you you need to do with your life. I don't have a college degree. I have a high school diploma. I was going to be a rock star. I decided when I was 10 and I bought my first record, it was Kiss Love Gun, 1977. And I decided when I first put that record, that needle on the record, and I Stole Your Love burst out of my Radio Shack speakers, I was going to be a rock star. And I was already into like fantasy, like the Lord of the Rings and all the Conan the Barbarian books and stuff like that. And I was going to be a writer on the side and rock, and then write books on tour on the bus, and then rock, and then rock. And my friends and I, when we got out of high school, we moved to Seattle, and we were going to be rock stars. And the story I tell there, and I think I can talk about it in this book, is we made the mistake of packing spandex and leather when we should have packed, ripped jeans and flannel. That was like right when the Seattle thing, the grunge thing started. And, obviously we didn't become rock stars, and the writing became the thing that I do. But again, I tell students that the thing that I consider myself, or consider my greatest success in my life, is my music. Because I never stopped. If you view my rock career from any of the measures of how we measure success, which is usually economic, it would be a failure of just epic, documentary-worthy proportions. Because the red versus the black is just not even on the same planet. But from 1983, when my friends and I put together our first rock band, to right this minute, that 41 years or whatever it is, there's maybe a year cumulative in bits and pieces over that time when I have not been in a rock band. And the rock band I'm in now, the guitarist and I have been playing together for over 20 years. And he just built a studio in his garage that is just beautiful. And I said, Jimmy, we're going to be like 90 years old writing riff rock in here. And he said, we're going to die in here. And I consider it success because I loved it. And despite so many people saying, just don't, just give it up, we never did because we love it. And I tell kids, all the things that you love now, chances are, when you're my age, you're still going to love them. You're still going to love them. And there's going to be points in your life when people are going to say, that's immature, you shouldn't like that. You shouldn't like this, you shouldn't do that, you should do this instead. And yes, you have to make some choices. But the things we love when we're kids are largely the things we love when we're adults. And why give that up? Why give it up? And my son, he's 30, and he was into all like the Dragon Ball Z and stuff like that when he was a little kid. And now I see 30-year-old adults, in Dragon Ball Z t-shirts. And the creator of that just passed away recently. And there's just this huge outpouring of love for what this guy's creation did for them. And I think of, like, when the first time I saw a trailer to The Fellowship of the Ring, I was in the theater and I just burst into tears. Because that was the dream when I was a kid. We'd sit around and talk about who would play these characters if they ever made a movie, which seemed impossible. And the same thing, like when the Avengers movies, before Marvel totally jumped the shark and now nobody cares what they do anymore, that first handful of movies was just so profound because those stories were what I grew up with. And those stories are foundational. I can sit here and talk about Anishinaabe stories that are a few thousand years old, and the only reason I care about them because I learned to care about stories about something else earlier in my life, and it just evolved from there. And I have, I'm as deeply connected to Gandalf and his quotes as I am to Nana Buju. They're the same to me. They're that important to me. Richard Wagamy says, all that we are is story. From the moment we are born to the time we continue on our spirit journey, we are involved in the creation of the story of our time here. It is what we arrive with. It is all we leave behind. We are not the things we accumulate. We are not the things we deem important. We are story, all of us. What comes to matter then is the creation of the best possible story we can while we're here. You, me, us, together. When we can do that and we take the time to share those stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. We change the world one story at a time. Richard Wagamy is an Ojibwe writer in Canada. He passed away a few years ago. Really big in Canada. He was just starting to be published in the United States when he passed away. And I just love that. The importance of story and poetry being part of all of that. Does anybody have any questions as I'm just blowtorching along here? Yes?
You mentioned 7 principles.
Yeah.
What is that?
The 7 grandfather teachings?
Yeah.
So it's like our blueprint for a living. So you've got humility, and each one is represented by a particular animal too. So humility is Maingat, which is the wolf. You've got courage, which is Magua, the bear. We've got respect, which is Bijiki, the buffalo. Honesty, Gagagi, the raven. I've got my cheat sheet here because I get rolling out. Did I say this? Did I say that? Wisdom is the beaver, a Mick. Truth is Misquadasi, turtle. And love is Migizi, bald eagle. And those are the 7. And the idea being that if you live according to those 7 principles, and they're all so related, you can't really have the one without attending to the others, then that is when every footstep
And
becomes
that's
a prayer.
Métis,
It's actually Anishinaabe, but Métis are Anishinaabe. So think of Anishinaabe as like an umbrella. And beneath that umbrella are multiple tribes. You've got Ojibwe, Chippewa, you've got Potawatomi, Odawa, Mississauga, there's like 6 or 8. And Métis are typically Anishinaabe because of our relationship as Ojibwe people, as Chippewa people. And Métis, for those who don't know, is a cultural designation recognized in Canada, but not the United States, even though we are everywhere, especially in Montana. Every community was either begun by Métis people or had Métis people living there. I just came from Lewistown this morning. I did a talk. This is like the second one today for a museum conference. And Lewistown was founded by our people. And so many people don't know that. And there are street names named for us. And there's just so much richness to our heritage. And this is another story I get emotional talking about. I'm very passionate about all of this because this is everything to who we are. And to get most information about Métis, you have to go to Canada because that's where most scholars are because of the relationship with the culture of the nation. You know, and the Métis flag flew before the Canadian flag did. So we've been around longer than Canada has been. And I was reading this paper the other night, and it was about the families the 25 families who came down from the Milk River after coming from the Red River to found Lewistown. And he was talking about their interrelationships, their kinship network, which we see right in front of me, right here, our kinship network, how we are all related, and how those families had been intermarried because of their relationship to the buffalo trade, and how the Métis were, and you don't hear about this in that stupid Burns documentary, you don't hear about how mighty the Métis buffalo hunting brigades were. And this Canadian scholar is making this case how for decades the Métis buffalo hunting brigades did not lose a single encounter with either American settlers, soldiers, or other tribes when they would clash over buffalo hunting territory. We were the power and the economic power, the military power. And I don't like to brag about military power, but we've been erased because they couldn't beat us. They couldn't beat any of the Plains tribes on the battlefield. You know, all of these big battles were camps with women and children while the men are out in those final days trying to hunt to find things to survive. They couldn't beat us, so what they did is they turned their guns on the buffalo. And if you look at where Native people used to be and where buffalo used to be, they overlap perfectly. And if you look to where the ranges were shrunk, they overlap perfectly. So I tell people that not just Métis, not just Ojibwe, not even just Blackfeet, Crow, Cheyenne, we all took the best shot that the most powerful country in the world took to eliminate us. We took it on the chin. And we're still here. And now we see how the world has reached this point where everybody's like, well, maybe these people who lived on this land for a few thousand years know a thing or two about how to live on this. And there's all in conservation and all of these things about, from both sides of the political fence, people recognize, well, if we're going to fight fires, maybe we should think about doing it the way they did it for a couple thousand years. Those types of things. And I feel this resurgence of indigenous value and people recognizing us for what we contributed how we did not lose our humility when it comes to our place in the world with everything else. And you know, those teachings are part of that. They're part of it. I really derailed myself with that answer. No more questions. Why don't, I mean, I'll read a couple more poems, but I like having conversations, and I would love to
Can I ask a
answer.
quick question?
Yes.
You're talking about the seven grandfathers.
Uh-huh.
Now, the mountains that are now the four presidents were called the seven grandfathers before white men came in and blasted them.
Uh-huh.
Is that the same seven grandfathers?
No, I don't think that was called the Seven Grandfathers. I think it was just Grandfather Mountain or something like that.
I thought it was the seven, but anyway,
Yeah, but-
that was the connection I made.
Sure. That's something different. I mean, the Black Hills are, and there's even conflict about, you know, the U.S. gave them to the Lakota, but all of those tribes use them, just like Yellowstone. So one of the things that modern historians like to do is they try and identify native territory in a way that we view things, like with these borders and boundaries and states, and I call it the like zoo enclosure view of native territory, where, you know, on your right you've got the Blackfeet, and coming on your left you've got the Salish, and it wasn't like that. And you see that like today, even how related we are. I was in Billings 2 weeks ago for an Indian Ed for All conference that OPI put on, and I was talking to a woman who works, she's from Fort Peck and works in their language revitalization program, and she, you know, we're talking, I tell her I'm Little Shell and blah, 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 and she says, do you know Iris Killeagle? And I said, yeah, she's on her tribal council. She goes, yeah, well, that's my mother-in-law. And that relationship through the kinship network I keep talking about, there's Donies enrolled on every tribal, you know, reservation in Montana. I mean, there's Donies everywhere, and Azures, and all of these names exist on all of the reservations because we were all marrying each other, and we always were. We were always trading, and sometimes we fought like hell. And my Blackfeet friends tease me all the time because I'm Ojibwe or Cree or Métis. And I remind them that if it wasn't for the Plains Chippewa, the Blackfeet still wouldn't know which end of the horse actually faces forward. And you can tell that to any of your Blackfeet friends. We tease each other. That's part of our native thing, is we poke a lot of fun at each other. But yeah, all of those relationships are shared. And I go back to Yellowstone, and same thing, that the Park Service recognizes, I think it's 27 tribes as having used Yellowstone, either living there or trading there or hunting there or foraging there, but the tribes ourselves recognize about 60. And you find like obsidian all over North America that came from Yellowstone. And these networks were vast and complicated for hundreds and hundreds of years before Europeans came. I'm going to read a poem, since allegedly that's why I'm here. I'm always self-conscious because since COVID, we're not supposed to lick our fingers anymore. And I've been doing it for 50 freaking years, so deal with it. This is one that we know who Robin Wall Kimmerer is, don't we? Does everybody know who Robin Wall Kimmerer is? She wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a global sensation. I mean, it has been translated into a bunch of languages. She, I feel like, is almost single-handedly at least made Anishinaabe views about the world, and because she's got a PhD in botany, and Braiding Sweetgrass is like mixing Western science with indigenous science, and how the two can complement each other as opposed to being opposite. Because when she was like an undergrad and just beginning, all of her advisors and professors would say, what you're studying isn't science, this is actually science. And she just kept up with it. And now people all over the world read this book, and it's like this big movement to re-indigenize things. And at the time I wrote this poem, I wasn't thinking of it as a dedication to her, but I've since started dedicating it to her. It's called Radical Hospitality. Rule number one when reading poems is you're not supposed to explain your poem before you read it, because usually you talk longer than the actual poem is. So maybe I'll explain it afterwards, and maybe I won't at all. But this is for Robin. Autumn late afternoon, and the leaf-falling moon is a round, ghostly presence, impossibly large in an impossibly blue sky. Grandfather's son, Mishamus, slips below the horizon, and just like that, the moon, Nukamus, reflects bright, the stars and planets waking all around her like fireflies emerging from the prairie. In trailers and shacks in distant woods, fire is stoked in stoves. Hands age-spotted and trembling feed the flames with dry, rich-smelling blocks of fresh split pine, fir, and larch. Can you feel heat that smells like fall's first soup and stew, bubbling atop hot iron during the cold, snowy months to come in that ancient valley beleaguered with its own pile of modern troubles? I sip cold water from a jug, feel the chill beginning to rise as the ridges to the west darken to silhouette and the sky streaks with deeper shades of pink. Where does the water come from and all that living wood? Who is the magnanimous donor who comforts us with these gifts? Given all of our wreaked havoc on the world, whose hospitality is most radical? That's about the earth, of course. And I wrote it after, so I'm on the advisory board for Swan Valley Connections in Condon, and I've never advised them on anything. I think I'm just on there because it looks good if there's another Indigenous person on their board of directors. But every fall, we do a volunteer thing called Firewood Day. And the idea is all the people in the community who are too old or too sick or whatever, for whatever reason, can't cut their own firewood. They put it in order with Swan Valley Connections, and a bunch of us get together, and there's a bunch of big logs, and there's people sawing those logs into rounds. Some of us split those rounds, and others load the split pieces onto trucks and trailers. We take them out up and down the valley and deliver them to the people who put in orders, and it takes all day. And it's one of those things that I love because of the cooperation. Because that valley, you've got every possible kind of person living there. From the crusty, tree-hugging dirt worshippers like me, to the turn around or you'll be shot, God bless Trump and Jesus and dinosaurs, people living out there. And as much as we are led to not get along with each other, for that day we do. I mean, everybody's in celebration of this community effort where the people who can provide for the people who can't for themselves. And I sound flippant in the divisions between who those people are. And, I apologize. I believe in some weird shit too. Like if I had to tell you yes or no, are we hurtling through the universe on the back of a turtle right now? I would say hell yes. We are. Like if we lived and died based on my answer, that's what I would answer. I believe in Bigfoot. The Anishinaabe believed in Bigfoot. Depending on where you live in the vast territory of the Anishinaabe people, the symbol, like where we live, for honesty is Gagagi, the raven. But in other parts, it's the forest man, it's Bigfoot, it's Saba. Which means Bigfoot has been in our consciousness for a long time. That's good enough for me. Sometimes it's just fun to believe stuff. So the point is we take all of our ideas about things, and rather than try and force them on each other, we celebrate our differences and we get along. That's diversity. Diversity isn't just, we got our gay guy, we got our native guy, we got a few women, we got some people who live from somewhere else, we got a few white people, but we all believe the same thing. That's not diversity. Diversity means different ideas. The line is at hate. So if your different idea then forces somebody else and they can't live the life they want to live, that's where we have a problem. So as long as we can avoid that hate, as long as we can recognize our necessity to get along as neighbors, regardless of what we believe. That one day, to me, is a perfect example of what Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, is the reciprocity that we have with the land and with each other, and how we can live together if we would just allow ourselves to. And I'm going to end with that, because nobody wants to listen to anybody talk for an hour. And I'll take questions. Yes?
Kurt Vonnegut Jr. once allegedly said, "We novelists drag our way through life, through life like gut-shot bears." Is there any community that you belong to that you might characterize in that brief and I think accurate way, perhaps?
Like a pithy little quote to...
There you go. We're having a conversation.
Yes, no, that I should be able to. Amazingly, I can't. I think Métis are the perfect North Americans. Because for 100 years, we took all that was good of these multiple cultures that were coming together and became something new. And we got along. And I keep coming back to that. But until other people, just like we see today, came and wanted what other people had and started stirring us up against each other, we had all of these different ideas, and we were taking what worked and what didn't work and living on the land and living with each other. And that, to me, is like the future of what, the past is the future of what we could be. And that's another Anishinaabe thing with the the seven fires prophecy. Where now we're at this point where we're on the precipice of destruction, and we need to go back down the trail and pick up the things, the attitudes and the ideas and the languages that we lost in order to move forward in a good way. And to me, that recognition of what we used to be as a people is what we all can be again. And that has nothing really to do with your question, but that's what I thought of when you asked it. There's somebody else had there. Yes?
So you said something about being at a conference for Indian education for all, and I've done a little bit of research into the 1972 Montana Constitution, which wrote into it that there shall be Indian education for all, and it seemed like it took a long time before we actually got around to fulfilling that promise in our schools. And I was just wondering, where do we stand today, and what steps do we need to take to make sure that Montana's schools are properly inculcated in Indigenous education for all?
Yeah, you're right. It was written into that Constitution, and then they changed one word from you will to you might. And that was what, and that might not be the exact, but it was basically that gave people an out to not have to teach Indigenous ed if they didn't want to. And it was the last legislature that the Indian caucus came back and said, look, this is in the Constitution, nobody's doing it. We need to put some teeth back into it. And so that's where we are. And, we have these conferences, and a friend of mine and I did 8-part Little Shell curriculum for middle schoolers that teachers can teach now. Any teacher in the state can use our curriculum to teach about the Little Shell. And there's all kinds of stuff like that. And, one of the conversations that we have is teachers are overwhelmed, and there's not enough of them. And a lot of, well, what can I do? And the idea being, teach one thing. Teach your students how to say, hello in the language of whoever tribal community you're nearby or on. And then the next year you teach another word. And pretty soon you've got 5 words. It's just one little thing at a time. And it doesn't have to be the whole thing. One little bit, because it's a long game. Everything is a long game. So that's kind of where we're at. Some schools are better off than others. They're farther along. Some schools have more money to do that. That's been the biggest thing I've seen traveling around the state as Poet Laureate, is just the discrepancy between what one school has versus what another school has. Your education should not be defined by how much money your parents make and how rich your neighborhood is. That sucks. And that is one of the things that really needs to change. And we see it. I mean, the differences that I can go within a day, it's mind-boggling. And you kind of know it, but until you see it, walk into Circle and there's 10 books on their library, and that's just not, it's not how we should be. Any other questions? Yes?
You must have talked to a lot of people who either look up to you because they want to be writers or they are writers. What do you say to people who are wanting to become a writer or are fellow writers to kind of, this is something to be?
Stay in your lane. No, I don't. I say, and this is all, that was a joke, but this is serious. I say don't be a jerk. Because the writing world is a tiny one, just like any other industry or vocation or whatever you want to call it, calling, it's a small world. And if you're a jerk and hard to work with and don't say thank you, because there's a lot of like blurbs. I was just before we were starting, a friend of mine wrote a book and she's meeting with her agent today and she was texting me about just drown me. The idea of blurbs where, you know, when you read a book and it says, so-and-so says this is the greatest book ever. It's something we all have to do. I had to go out and get people to blurb my book and it sucks asking people. But we all recognize it and we all just kind of, oh God, and then we do it. But if you're just a jerk about it, or if you don't come through when you say you will, or if you're just hard to work with, that is most important. The easy part, and it's not easy, but the easy part is actually doing the work. It's all the other stuff, if you want to get it out in the world, it can be challenging. And if you can cultivate a lot of people who want to help you succeed, there's enough for all of us, then your attitude is so important. Anything else? Yes.
So for those of us that aren't writers, but that believe in the power of story, and as you were talking, you know, that the arts is what we need, what do you think that communities can do to help build a culture where we're more supportive of story?
I think you need to show up for things like this. So kudos to all of you who showed up for this. Things like this are happening all the time, you know, and I went out a couple weeks ago through, everything I say is like a couple weeks ago, it might have been 6 months ago. I was in Helena for the Poetry Out, the state finals of Poetry Out Loud. Has anybody heard of Poetry Out Loud? So what Poetry Out Loud is, it starts out like in regions of kids recite poems from memory. And they win contests and they advance. So this was the state final. And the winner in Helena of the thing that I was at is going on to DC to represent Montana for the national final. And you know, they win money or something. But there was, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15 kids there. And I had really no idea what I was into going in. And, you know, I just winged it. But you know, there was a decent turnout. But it's hard. And the job those students did was, I was mind blown because I can't feet skilled at finding cat puke in the dark. That's the limit of my ability to recite poetry. And the girl who won, I think she's a junior in Butte maybe, her first poem was like 8 minutes long. And it was flawless. And the passion. And then in her second poem, they each read twice. And then that got it down to like, I think 4 or 5 people, and then they read a third one. I mean, I was in tears, and no, it wasn't her work. But so what? I'm not original. I'm just taking bits and pieces from all that stuff that I've been just absorbing my whole life and redoing it or whatever. But it was spectacular, and I loved it so much. And I would have loved it to be in a theater with about 500 people in it. Just showing up. And it's hard to find time for things like that, but, you know, Netflix is going to be there when you get home. And I think that's how it is in so many areas of our life. Civic involvement, going out and knocking on doors or showing up for school board meetings. Just showing up in everything is how we change things. Yeah?
Just a quick plug on that note, the proprietress of our local bookstore, Cassiopeia, is in the audience tonight.
I see her back there.
Is hosting a poetry reading event night at some point in the near future, and the guy I call our local Lin-Manuel Miranda hosts these, and he's as impressive as that young person you were just describing.
Yeah,
And I encourage everyone to come, just listen if you want to, or bring poetry you've written.
yeah.
It's a real fun night. I
Yeah.
can't say what the date is, because I haven't found out yet. but
Sure.
It's happening.
Well, if we think of everything that makes our lives build it better, it's almost entirely arts. What if we're watching Netflix or any of these shows or whatever, writers wrote that stuff. Actors are acting. It's all art, and it's easy for us to think, well, why should we pay for that? Because if we don't have any artists anymore, and showing up is just too important. Anybody else? Yes.
For doing what you're doing.
What's that?
Keep on doing what you are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just talked to Millie a couple days ago about we're going to do like a pre-order campaign for this through her store. And I would love to sell a bunch of these through your store. Because I'm going to be back August
23rd.
23rd. Thank you. Which is the Friday night of the Little Shell Powwow. Here. In this room or a different one? This room, okay. We're going to pack this thing. And it's going to be great. And I really hope the Little Shell people come out for it. This is for the Little Shell. And everybody else.
I
Yes.
just want to tell short, my grandnephew, who is about 6 years old, is printed a little story and took it to his mom and showed it to her. And she said, "Do you want to be a writer when you grow up?" And he said, "I already am a writer."
Good for him.
Even better.
Yeah, good for him. Anyone else? Yes.
Where did you learn most of the indigenous languages that you have?
I just pick it up here and there. There's some people online that do like words of the day. One of the Wisconsin Ojibwe tribes did a thing through Rosetta Stone.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, and I just cobble it together and learn stuff where I can.
Do you have any elders in your life that still speak it? Or?
No.
No.
The last fluent first language Ojibwe speaker in Montana died during COVID.
Mm.
We don't have any left. And that's a tragedy. You know, it's still spoken in Canada and Minnesota and North Dakota. And, you know, it's in peril, but it's not like on the verge of extinction.
Mm-hmm.
But the favorite quote, you know, when the Pope was in Canada a couple of years ago doing his little dog and pony show to apologize for boarding schools, and a Canadian artist, Christy Belcourt, who's just magnificent, said, if the Catholics really want to reconcile what they did, they should fund indigenous immersion language schools in North America for the next 100 years. I said, yeah, they can afford it, you know? And there are, you know, there's immersion schools on the various reservations. You know, there's probably half a dozen at least in Montana, but we don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Chris, my brother still speaks Ojibwe. Anthony.
Yeah, yes. But is he in Montana?
No, he's on the Turtle Creek
Yeah,
Reservation.
yeah. So, you know,
It's still
Not-
there, but not here.
yeah, yeah.
But he goes up to Canada as well and works with the tribes up there.
Yeah,
He just actually got back, or they just came to him from, I can't remember, Montreal, I think.
mm-hmm,
And they came down and did a documentary with him because of the scrolls.
yeah,
That, and also his father-in-law, who's no longer here, handed that all down to him. And so he has one of the original songs that was taught a long time ago from his father-in-law.
yeah,
And so they documented that song to bring it back.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's happening all over Indian country, as we call it.
Right.
Like I said, there's a resurgence, there's an interest. And that's important. And it takes everybody, not just the tribes ourselves, but we need help. Yes?
You talk about the resurgence and interest, and you also talked about being around young kids a lot. So there's a resurgence and interest in YA, Indigenous books. Have you considered writing one? Being around kids with your current job?
I've thought about it. When I years ago when I was thinking about what kind of a writer I wanted to be, I wanted to publish fiction, at least one novel, one book of nonfiction, and one book of poetry. And I always thought poetry would be the hard one. And now I've got 2 books of poetry, and this is nonfiction. And I've thought about it. Just recently I've thought about it. So maybe.
It says like Marrow Thieves, Fire King.
Right? Yep.
That's something that.
Yeah. They do like YA versions of books like mine. So maybe that'll happen, I don't know. But I've thought about it. But I can't really cuss like I like to, though.
Have you read mine?
Yeah, that's true. I know, that's true. Yes?
Where did you grow up? Where were you raised?
So I grew up in Frenchtown, outside of Missoula, and that's where I live now. I have a Missoula address, but the kids in my neighborhood go to Frenchtown, so as far as I'm concerned, it's Frenchtown. But my family is from Lewistown. My dad was born in Lewistown. His parents were born in Lewistown. I just visited my great-great-grandparents' grave yesterday. They were the original Latrays to come to Lewistown, so I feel like that's where I'm from, but I was born in Frenchtown, which was also a Red River Métis resettlement area. Well, thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was fantastic. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I absolutely enjoy seeing all of you again on this warm spring day. Just a few things I wanted to let you guys know. This book that's coming out in August, I 100% encourage you to support our local bookstore and support our author here. But if you find that you cannot do that, or you also want to support your local library, we did order 2 copies, and you can start putting those on hold now. So that's super exciting. If you all put it on hold now, we might order another one. Thank you all for coming out. Again, this was part of our Winter Speaker Series. Our next Winter Speaker Series is the 3rd Thursday of whatever next month is, April. And we will be having John Clayton do storytelling in public lands, and that will be another program sponsored by Humanities Montana, much like this one was. So thank you all again for coming out. Travel safe and have a great rest of your evening.